When you mention you are going to play Fallout 76 in 2026, the first thing everyone thinks is, does that game still exist? It is inevitable. The reputation the game carries is so heavy that it precedes any conversation about what it has become. Even before clicking play, we already arrive with a backpack full of memes, bad news, and the feeling that we are about to enter a graveyard of Bethesda's promises. Recalling the 2018 launch is almost like reliving a collective trauma of the industry. We came from Fallout 4, which despite being controversial still had a soul, and were introduced to an online world that felt like it had been thrown onto the market before it finished cooking. The map of Appalachia was gigantic, 4 times larger than Fallout 4's, but devoid of purpose, with only 24 players per session and a justification that the loneliness was intentional to create a realistic post-apocalypse. In practice, this only served to make everything more desolate and tedious. And then came the Festival of Bugs that bordered on the absurd. Enemies simply paralyzed in the environment, ignoring your existence until you killed them. Creatures fused into the ground or walls, making them impossible to hit. Texturing that turned water into black smudges, and unexpected crashes that closed the game out of nowhere. I remember the promise was that a 50 gigabytes day 1 patch would solve the problems, but it only served to confirm that the game was not ready to leave the store. What hurt the most, however, was the lack of human NPCs. Bethesda took everyone alive off the map under the excuse that no one survived, leaving us to interact with terminals, holotapes, and robots. Instead of dialogues and moral choices that made sense, the narrative became a marathon of reading text on computers and listening to the voices of people who were already dead. That charm of finding strange characters in the wasteland, of living chaotic situations, simply did not exist. It did not take long for the game to become an internet joke. Massacred reviews, scores like 4 out of 10, lists of the worst games of 2018, and a general feeling that Bethesda had disrespected the legacy of the franchise. YouTube channels, forums, and social media turned Fallout 76 into the perfect synonym for how not to launch a game. Even Todd Howard himself admitted that many of the criticisms received were deserved, and that the developer knew the game would have issues. When the company has to publish an official list of bugs and still delivers collector's editions with nylon bags instead of canvas, you know the ship has sunk. Over time, the game stopped being just a bad title and became a negative cultural reference. Fallout 76 became that example people use when they want to talk about disastrous launches, about the greed of companies that push unfinished products, about the downfall of a major developer. It became synonymous with a failure so great that to this day, when someone mentions the name, the collective memory is still of 2018, not 2026. The reputation it carried was almost an extra character in the game, a ghost hovering over every terminal, every quest, every update that tried to fix the impossible. The question that hammered in my head was, after so much time, after so many patches, did it manage to escape this prison of bad memories? Or are we still, in a way, paying the price of 2018? When I logged into Fallout 76 for the first time, I did so with skepticism. In my mind, I wasn't opening a game. I was stepping into a sort of historical ruin, into one of those cases that the internet decreed a failure before many people even tested it for themselves. I expected to find a dead, empty, abandoned game, almost like a mall after the end of the world. This didn't come from my own experience with the game, but from the reputation built since its launch, when it was branded by heavy criticism, technical issues, and a premise that disappointed many people. And the most curious thing is that this prejudice does not only stem from those who played in 2018. It also lives in those who have never touched the game, because Fallout 76 became a name loaded with a bad reputation, one of those you know through the mockery, the disaster videos, and the idea that it was a major mistake by Bethesda. Before playing, I already associated the name of the game with bugs, the absence of human NPCs, and a world that felt more like an incomplete experiment than a real Fallout. This image became very strong because a large part of the reviews at the time treated the game as a serious disappointment, and not just as a below-average launch. So my entry into the game was contaminated by this legacy. I didn't start out curious. I started out suspicious, almost waiting for the moment when the game would confirm everything I had heard for years. The reputation of 2018 still weighs heavily because it was larger than the game itself. Many people don't know exactly what changed afterward, but they know perfectly well that Fallout 76 was treated as a symbol of a problematic launch, and that is enough to shape their opinion even before the first hour of gameplay. Because of this, playing Fallout 76 today feels strange right from the start. You don't just face the game, you also face the collective memory of it. And perhaps the most interesting part of this experience is precisely that. Realizing how much I went in expecting a digital corpse, when, in reality, the biggest ghost there was the reputation it carried. My first surprise with Fallout 76 was realizing that behind all the bad reputation of the launch, there was a world that hooked me almost immediately. After years of hearing about bugs, heavy criticism, and the absence of human NPCs early in the game's life, I honestly did not expect to feel this in the very first hours. What truly grabbed me was the map. Appalachia has a very strong presence, and the feeling of walking through this world is different from that imagery of a failed game that has stuck to Fallout 76 since 2018. There is something in the atmosphere that works very well. The mountains, the broken roads, the abandoned buildings, and that strange silence of the landscape create a very distinct identity, as if the game finally managed to sell the fantasy of exploring a less caricaturized and more melancholic post-apocalypse. And that is when the most curious sensation hit me. This doesn't feel like the Fallout 76 I knew. The name still carried the image of a technical and creative disaster in my head, but what I was seeing at that moment was a world with personality, with texture, and with a desire to be explored. Exploration, in particular, carries massive weight in this first impression. Even with all the negative baggage built around the game, wandering aimlessly, discovering strange places, and finding small details scattered across the environment gave me a sense of discovery that I didn't expect to feel here. Perhaps the strangest thing is precisely this. The game I imagined finding was almost a running joke, but its world does not behave like a joke. It has presence, it has atmosphere, and at several moments, it made me think that the foundation of Fallout 76 was always better than its reputation made it seem. So this first surprise was not, wow, the game is perfect, but rather, man, this place is too good to be remembered only for its failure. And perhaps that is where the most fascinating side of playing Fallout 76 in 2026 begins, discovering that behind the disastrous reputation, there was always an environment strong enough to make you forget for a moment everything you heard about it. What caught my attention most about Fallout 76 in 2026 is that it really gives the impression of having turned into another game, far removed from that version that launched surrounded by heavy criticism, bugs, and strange decisions. The impression that remains playing today is of a project that spent years being rebuilt piece by piece until it became something much closer to a stable and inviting experience. This feels even stronger when I remember the starting point. At launch, the game was harshly criticized for technical issues, the lack of human NPCs, and a narrative structure that felt cold and devoid of depth. So the contrast with the current image hits almost immediately. It is as if I am seeing the late version of an idea that, in 2018, was clearly not ready to exist. For me, the change shows up a lot in how the world feels more inhabited and more capable of pulling you forward. If before the absence of human NPCs made the journey dependent on robots, terminals, and recordings, today the feeling is of a narratively richer experience, which aligns with the perception that the game became completely different after so many updates. The quests also seem to play an important part in this transformation. When a game stops being remembered only as a charmless multiplayer mess and starts being revisited years later by reviews focusing on plot, narrative, content, and exploration, it shows that the experience has gained much more substance than its original reputation suggested. Another thing that gives me this feeling of a complete turnaround is realizing that the game today has far more layers of activity and retention. The fact that more recent reviews highlight endgame content, season systems, servers, community performance, and other systems shows a much more robust package than that launch product, which felt incomplete. And there is also the side of quality of life improvements, even if they don't always make the headlines. When a game spends years receiving fixes, adjustments, and continuous evolution from a state that even Bethesda itself recognized as problematic, the natural result is a more polished and less hostile experience for newcomers. Because of this, the best way I can find to summarize this part is very personal. Fallout 76 doesn't just feel like a game that survived, it feels like a game that was transformed by time. And perhaps that is precisely the strangest and most interesting aspect of playing in 2026, realizing that years of updates managed to turn a symbol of failure into something that today has much more identity, content, and a life of its own. The multiplayer is strange in a way I truly did not expect. It does not give me that classic vibe of a loud MMO, full of people running in circles and systems screaming for attention all the time. It feels more like a solo Fallout that occasionally lets other people bump into your story. The most curious thing is that this completely changes how I approach the game. Instead of feeling like I am playing an online game all the time, I get the impression of exploring Appalachia alone, at my own pace, almost as if the multiplayer were in the background rather than driving the experience. And this works in a very specific way. Other players appear naturally, without the feeling of constant intrusion, and many interactions happen in a simple, almost polite manner, as if the game had created a space where human presence exists, but does not swallow the atmosphere. I like this because it doesn't turn the world into permanent social chaos. There is a strange calm in crossing paths with someone, swapping quick help, sharing an event, or just going your own way without needing to form a group, negotiate roles, or enter that heavy logic of traditional MMOs. In practice, it seems Fallout 76 understood that not all multiplayer needs to be invasive. It lets you live the fantasy of a lone survivor, but without locking you in total isolation, because there is always a chance of crossing paths with another player and having that end up improving the journey rather than breaking it. This coexistence is what grabs me the most. It is not a multiplayer that screams, "Look at how massive we are," but rather one that whispers, "There are other people here, but it's fine to stick to your corner." This makes the experience more organic and, honestly, much more like the kind of world Fallout always wanted to be. The multiplayer in Fallout 76 is strange because it does not seem built to compete with traditional MMOs. It seems built to coexist with single-player Fallout, and this unlikely mixture is precisely what makes the game so different, and so good in a way I didn't expect. One of the things that surprised me the most was the behavior of the community. I went in expecting that chaotic online environment where veteran players ignore beginners or turn every encounter into a dispute, but the impression I got was almost the opposite. Right at the beginning, you can feel that many people recognize players who just stepped out of the vault. And instead of using the level difference to cause trouble, several players seem to make an effort to help, whether by pointing a direction, inviting you to an activity, or simply leaving resources along the way. There is something very funny about receiving a gift from a stranger in a post-apocalyptic game. You are there with a weak weapon, few bottle caps, and trying to understand 10 systems at the same time, when someone in absurd power armor appears, makes a gesture, and drops ammo, food, water, gear, or crafting plans on the ground. It is not that every player will become your best friend, but cooperation seems to be the default, much more than hostility. In public events, for example, the feeling is that people naturally band together to solve the problem, defeat massive enemies, and collect the rewards, without requiring that rigid organization of traditional MMOs. This also makes the game much more comfortable for newcomers. I never felt like I had to keep up with everyone else's pace or prove that I knew everything. I could explore on my own time, and when someone was nearby, their presence almost always contributed to the experience instead of disrupting it. And it is curious to think that this contrasts so sharply with Fallout 76's reputation. The game became known for a problematic launch and a massive negative reputation, but the community that stayed and kept playing ended up creating a culture far more welcoming than I imagined. Perhaps this is one of the strangest and best parts of playing Fallout 76 in 2026. A world that should be brutal and desolate ends up bringing together people willing to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. It is a quiet, highly spontaneous kindness, and it makes Appalachia feel much more alive. Deep down, I think the big problem with Fallout 76 was never the idea itself, but rather the moment it was put out into the world. Playing in 2026, it becomes increasingly clear to me that there was an interesting foundation there, but it released before it was truly ready. When I think about the launch, the feeling is of a game that asked to be judged at the very moment it was still forming. Bugs, a lack of NPCs, irregular performance, and strange decisions made many people conclude that the entire premise was bad, when perhaps the real mistake was rushing something that needed more time. And this changes a lot of how I view the game today. Because, honestly, Fallout 76 does not look like a failed idea to me. It looks like an idea that was exposed too early, without the necessary layer of polish to convince the public right away. The most unfair part is that a bad first impression can become a prison. Once a game gains a reputation as a disaster, any future improvements end up being ignored by many, because the collective memory has already decided what it is before even revisiting the work. This is exactly what happened to Fallout 76. The image of the launch became so strong that it ended up defining the game for years. Even as the content evolved, the reputation continued to act as a shadow, as if the game were always owing an explanation to its past. And I feel this happens more intensely with online games because they don't have the luxury of asking the public, "Wait a minute, let me finish." If the debut is bad, the damage is set in stone. The player doesn't just remember what they saw later, they remember the feeling of being greeted by a broken product. So looking at Fallout 76 in 2026, I am left with this somewhat bitter and curious impression. Perhaps the game always had more potential than it seemed in 2018. The problem was not necessarily the idea, but the first impression, and sometimes that is precisely what defines a game's fate for too long. One of the things that catches my attention most in Fallout 76 is the almost absurd weight of its reputation. Even years after a launch surrounded by heavy criticism and technical issues, the name of the game still arrives before the actual experience, as if many people already have a ready-made opinion just by hearing Fallout 76. I feel there is an inherited prejudice passed down almost by word of mouth across the internet. Many people speak ill of it without ever having gone back, without checking what changed, without even testing the current version, because the image that stuck was that of the problematic 2018 game. And I can even understand where that comes from. When a launch becomes synonymous with disappointment, with reviews describing the game as a multiplayer mess, lacking human NPCs and filled with technical flaws, this first impression sticks in a way that is very hard to remove. The internet also played a massive role in this. Fallout 76 was not just criticized, it was turned into a symbol, a recurring joke, an easy example of how not to launch a game, and this made the disastrous version almost more famous than the game itself. The problem is that the reputation became frozen in time, while the game did not. More recent reviews and revisits treat Fallout 76 as a very different experience, highlighting an expanded narrative, endgame content, seasons, community, and improvements accumulated over the years. For me, this is the most curious part of playing in 2026. It feels like there are two Fallout 76s. The real game, which continued to be adjusted and expanded, and the imaginary game that has lived in many people's heads since launch. In the end, the weight of reputation is perhaps one of the most unfair and most fascinating things in this story. The internet eternalized the image of the disaster, but the game kept evolving in silence. And this gap between reputation and reality is precisely what makes it so strange to sit down and play today, thinking, man, nobody told me it had come this far. To me, Fallout 76 became one of those games that teach us more about the industry than about themselves. When I look at it in 2026, I don't just see a curious case of recovery, I see a very clear portrait of an era in which launching before a game is ready became almost a production method. Its launch helps us understand this very well. In 2018, the game was marked by heavy criticism, technical issues, the absence of human NPCs, and a reception so poor that even Bethesda itself admitted many criticisms were deserved. This does not feel like an isolated accident. It feels like the kind of failure that exposes an entire logic. The feeling I get is that the industry has become dangerously accustomed to the idea that everything can be fixed later. The game launches incomplete, the player base complains, the studio promises updates, and everyone pretends this is a natural part of the process, as if the launch had turned into a sort of full-priced early access. The most curious thing is that Fallout 76 also shows why this gamble seduces so many companies. Years later, revisits to the game already speak of a very different experience, with more content, an expanded narrative, more robust systems, and a general perception of real transformation over time. In other words, sometimes indeed you can rebuild what was born broken. Except this model has an built-in cruelty. For every game that manages to survive long enough to reinvent itself, I wonder how many others simply die along the way, without a second chance, because the community leaves before the good version finally exists. And that is where Fallout 76 feels almost like an educational exception. It had the budget, the franchise name, and the prolonged support needed to keep receiving fixes and expansions for years, to the point where many people today see a very different product from that initial disaster. But not every game has this privilege, and not every studio can buy time after a bad debut. The lesson I take away is a bit uncomfortable. Fallout 76 proves that a game can improve a lot. But it also proves that the industry has started treating the public as testers for unfinished products. And perhaps the strangest part of this story is precisely that. The game became an example of recovery, yes, but before that, it had already been a much more important example of how launching too early can warp the relationship between the work, the studio, and the player. For me, yes, Fallout 76 is worth it in 2026, but not in the most obvious way possible. It didn't become the best Fallout, and it didn't become a perfect game either, but it transformed into an experience that today exists far beyond the joke it carried for years. What I feel most playing now is that the game finally found its own identity. It no longer tries to compete with the classic single-player Fallout games as if it were the same thing, and that makes all the difference, because I can see more clearly what it wants to be. There are still things that bother me, of course. It is not a game I would hold up as an example of perfection, nor as an unquestionable masterpiece. But it stopped looking like a walking disaster and started looking like a living, strange world with a personality of its own. And that changes everything about the experience. Playing in 2026 is not about revisiting a failure. It is about entering a game that has been patched, expanded, and adjusted until it became much more interesting than its reputation suggested. It is almost as if the version left in the collective memory and the current version are no longer the same object. The craziest thing is that the game still carries the shadow of the past even after so much evolution. Many people continue to talk about it as if it had stopped at launch, but the truth is that it kept moving forward while the mockery remained frozen in time. So in the end, my answer is simple. It is worth it, yes, if you go in knowing what it is today and not what it was back then. It didn't become a miracle, but it became something much more worthy of attention than the internet made it seem for years. Sometimes a game's worst enemy is not its current quality, it is the reputation it built at launch.
You seem to easily forget.